Do you truly dare to listen? This story has never been told before, because those who knew it never lived to see the end. But today you will learn the truth. Be prepared, for what I'm about to reveal will change how you see darkness forever. Start now if you're brave enough. On a December morning in 1975, as frost clung to the windows of Amityville, the Lutz family stood before their unknown fate. That old Victorian house they had bought at a bargain price, believing it to be an unbeatable deal. Its aged wooden facade, the shattered windows like dead eyes, the sagging roof as if groaning under the weight of bloody memories. Everything in this place screamed that it was not just a house. George Lutz, the head of the family, tried to suppress the chill that ran down his spine as he touched the corroded doorknob. It was cold as a corpse, as if someone was holding it from the other side. Kathy, his wife, suddenly felt a tightness in her chest as she watched their children run toward the door with innocence. An innocence that might cost them their lives. Before they entered, Kathy noticed a small brass plaque on the wall, inscribed with, "In memory of the Lutz family, November 13th, 1974. When she asked about it, George exhaled sharply and said, "Just the previous owners. Don't worry about it." But even he couldn't explain why his hands trembled as he traced his finger over the engraved date, as if the walls were bleeding memories of that cursed day. Inside, the stench of mold choked the air, despite the realtor's assurance that the place had been thoroughly cleaned. Daniel, the eldest son, saw a shadow slip behind the kitchen door. Kathy heard a faint moan from the upper floor as she unpacked dishes. And George, who went down to the basement to inspect the old furniture, found broken wooden stairs, as if someone had been trying to escape them not long ago. But the strangest thing was that window in the master bedroom, the one that stayed tightly shut, no matter how fiercely the wind howled outside. Yet every morning, Kathy found it wide open, as if something was coming in and out each night. This was no home. It was a trap, and the family didn't yet know that the walls weren't empty, but filled with unseen eyes, ears that heard every whisper, and mouths waiting eagerly to devour them one by one. The darkness did not merely arrive, it awoke something else. As the last glimmer of sunlight vanished behind Amityville's frost-cloaked trees, the house began to breathe. At exactly 9 o'clock, while Kathy washed dishes, she heard the first whisper. Not some passing sound, but as if someone stood directly behind her, lips pressed to her ear, murmuring broken words. "Your room now, but soon it'll be." George, the ex-soldier who only believed what he could see, laughed when she told him. But his laughter died at midnight, when he heard a child's weeping from the basement. The same weeping that had suddenly stopped when Kathy asked Missy, "Why are you crying, sweetheart?" Only for her daughter to reply blankly, "But I wasn't crying. It's the other girl. The antique clock in the hall, which George had proudly bought at auction, began acting strangely. On the 13th of the month, its hands froze at 3:15 a.m., the exact time the previous family's bodies were found. By morning, every clock in the house, even Missy's little bedside one, had stopped at that same cursed hour. But what terrified Kathy most were the footsteps. Each night, she heard heavy, dragging steps in the upstairs hallway, pausing outside their bedroom, then slowly retreating. One night, she peered through the door crack and saw a tall, black shadow at the hall's end, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if sniffing their fear. Then came the worst night. Kathy woke to an icy hand on her shoulder. Opening her eyes, she found Missy standing beside the bed, pupils blown wide. "Mommy," the child whispered in a voice not quite her own. "The girl in the corner says we have to play. She wants to show you her new doll." When Kathy turned on the light, Missy was asleep in bed, but on the floor beside her, small muddy footprints led to the room's empty corner. This was no mere haunting. The house was hungry. With each night, the whispers grew clearer, the shadows thicker, the cold more piercing. Like flowers wilting in a cursed vase, the Lutz family was fading inside those ravenous walls, as Amityville's bloody past prepared to repeat itself. She wasn't searching for the truth. The truth was lying in wait for her in the dark corners of the archives. As Kathy flipped through the brown files in the local Amityville library, an old newspaper photo fell into her hands. November 13th, 1974. The image that froze the blood in her veins, the face of young Ronald Lutz, staring straight into the camera, his eyes, oh God, his eyes like two dark holes in a fossilized skull. His pupils were unnaturally dilated, like windows into a bottomless void. The headline screamed, "Son slays his family in night of madness, claims the walls ordered him to do it." But the details the newspapers never published were worse. The cursed knife, but it was etched with strange symbols that only appeared under moonlight. A guard noticed the blood on it moved as if alive, forming unreadable words before vanishing. The chase of the dead. The bloody footprints between rooms revealed a bizarre pattern. The victims hadn't fled randomly. It looked like they'd been forced into a game of hide-and-seek. The most horrifying part? Some prints showed large feet following small ones, as if the killer had hunted them one by one. The doll of terror. The doll Ronald found in his youngest sister's arms had once been ordinary, but it had transformed. The stitching around its mouth was freshly torn, as if forced to scream. Lab tests revealed its stuffing wasn't normal. It contained human hair from every family member. And now, exactly 1 year later, the house was repeating itself. The bloody drawings, they weren't random sketches. They were a blueprint for future crimes. One depicted Missy with her head severed. But by evening, new details appeared. A small hand holding the knife, and a tall figure watching from the corner with a grin. Most terrifying, the drawings spoke. When touched with a wet finger, faint whispers repeated, "She's coming, she's coming." The stench of death. It wasn't just decay, it was intelligent. At exactly 3 a.m., the smell traced a path from the master bedroom to the kitchen, the same path the last Lutz victim had taken. George found its source, a closet that reeked strongest when opened, and inside, something warm and wet brushed his fingers before disappearing. The eyeless stalker. Daniel didn't just see the man without eyes. He heard a hiss from thin air. Hide and seek isn't over. You'll play with me this time." The next morning, bruises resembling restraint marks circled his wrist, and a tiny doll wrapped in human hair lay by his bed. But the most horrifying discovery came from where they least expected: the enchanted basement. The blood murals weren't just from 1864, they were layers of horror. 1864, hunting scenes, but the animals had human faces. 1923, torture diagrams drawn with anatomical precision. 1974, details of the Lutz murders a week before they happened, including camera angles as if the walls themselves had witnessed the events. The rusted chain was still warm to the touch, and once it moved on its own, like someone struggling against it. The small notebook had 2 extra pages that appeared after 2 days, a list of the Lutz family's names and exact birth dates, a date in different handwriting, November 13th, 1975, with a new note: "This time we'll take them all." The house wasn't haunted. It was a hungry entity learning from every meal. Ronald Lutz had merely been the appetizer in a long blood feast, and the Lutz family was the main course, waiting to be served. Worst of all, the walls had started talking to them, not in Ronald's voice, but in the voices of past victims, begging them to flee before it was too late. Kathy knew the house was watching her. It wasn't just some paranoid thought. It was a bone-chilling reality. Every night, as she tried to sleep, she could hear heavy breathing seeping through the walls, as if the house itself were a living entity lying in wait. And that night, she discovered the black secret while searching for a lost key. Kathy noticed a strange crack in the basement floor, as if someone had pried it open before and left it slightly ajar. When she pushed the heavy wooden plank aside with trembling hands, she uncovered a spiral staircase descending deeper than any part of the house should go. The air rising from below was unnaturally cold, carrying the stench of rotting flesh and old oil. She descended. The stairs groaned beneath her feet as though unused for decades. The only light came from a single candle she clutched in her shaking hand, its flickering shadow dancing across walls, covered in bizarre inscriptions, drawings of hanged people, dismembered families, and eyes, so many eyes, watching her every move. And at the bottom, she found the room that didn't exist on any blueprint. At the center of the room stood a massive mirror veiled in black cloth, bound by rusted chains. The feeling that washed over her was unnatural, as if something urged her to uncover it. When she pulled the cloth away with trembling hands, the mirror did not reflect her. Instead, she saw the children's bedroom in the Lutz house, but wrong. Blood coated the walls. The beds were overturned, and in the corner, a tall, faceless shadow stood, clutching something in its hand. Then suddenly, the shadow turned toward her. "Finally, you found your way inside." The voice of Ronald Lutz echoed from the mirror, but it wasn't alone. Other voices blended into it. Screams, moans, muffled laughter. Then, the hands. Pale hands shot out from the mirror's surface, grabbing Kathy's wrists with inhuman strength, dragging her toward the glass. She screamed, but no one heard. The candle fell, plunging her into darkness. And in the blackness, she felt something crawling on her skin. Cold fingers tracing her face. That same night, George awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. When he stepped out, he found a small doll placed in front of his door, a doll that hadn't been there minutes before. When he picked it up, its head twisted backward, and a whisper slithered out, "You're next in the game." Then suddenly, all the lights in the house went out. In the dark, he heard his children screaming, but the sounds came from different rooms, as if they were being moved impossibly fast. And then, the laughter, a man's choked laugh, tangled with a child's weeping. By dawn, they discovered the drawings on the walls had changed. Now there was a new image, a portrait of the entire family, but their faces were distorted, their bodies hanging from the ceiling by black strings. And in the corner, the tall man stood, holding a pair of large scissors. Beneath the image, written in blood, "Time is running out. Will you hide, or will I find you easily?" The demonic recorder switched on by itself. This time, it captured new voices, a heavy breath repeating every minute, a child whispering, "Mommy, he's in the closet." The sound of a knife carving into wood. And finally, Kathy's own voice screaming, "It's not Ronald. It's something else, something older." The most horrifying part? This recording was made before the words were ever spoken. Now, the house had sealed them inside. The doors wouldn't open. The windows were locked tight, as if fused shut by an inhuman will. Even the phones no longer worked, unless they dialed numbers that didn't exist. And at midnight, the walls began to move. Slender fingers slithered from the corners, brushing the floor, then vanishing. Blood seeped from the ceiling, forming words on the ground. The countdown has begun. 6, 5, 4. And in the basement, the mirror activated again. This time it showed the entire family, but their faces were twisted, their eyes completely black. Behind them, the tall man smiled. 3, 2, 1. Total power failure. In the darkness, they heard the front door creak open. Someone or something had entered the house, and one thing became terrifyingly clear. The game wasn't meant to scare them. The game was meant to summon something, and now it had arrived that night. The night no one ever recorded, when the last candle in the Lutz house flickered out, when even the insects stopped crawling in fear. Something happened beyond human comprehension. Kathy, who thought she now understood the rules of the game, stood in the center of the low-ceilinged basement, where the air was so thick, each breath felt like shards of glass in her lungs. Before her, that ancient mirror was no mere mirror. It was a thin membrane, separating our world from another, one that had been slowly tearing since the moment they entered the house. The pale hands that had grabbed her earlier weren't ghosts' hands, but the appendages of something far greater, something that breathed through the cracks in the walls, something that licked the house's interior nightly, feeding on traces of their fear, intoxicated by the scent of their panic. George, who ran through the upper floors with feet heavy as stone, didn't realize each step led him in circles back to the same room. The room where he'd first found that doll. The doll that was now larger, its clothes seemingly stitched from his youngest daughter's garments. The children, or what remained of them, no longer screamed. They now whispered in words not of our language, words that bent the air around them like heated iron. The youngest, the green-eyed one, smiled as black blood seeped from his ears, as if hearing a beautiful song the others couldn't perceive. The tall man was never a man, just an idea that took form, a hungry shadow that learned tangibility. When it finally moved from its corner, what they heard wasn't footsteps, but the sound of reality itself tearing, like ancient paper shredded by invisible hands. When the countdown reached 0, the expected silence never came. Instead, the house erupted in noise, like hundreds of mouths opening for the first time, like the grinding of teeth left unclenched for centuries. The walls bent like paper, the floor rippled like black liquid, and in that moment, before darkness swallowed them whole, Kathy saw the truth. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. Not by spirits, not by evil forces, but by something ancient that had slept beneath the earth for ages. Something that turned the house into a trap, a mouth, a slow, digestive machine. Every family that came here was just another meal, making the entity stronger, hungrier. The new dolls on the shelf weren't warnings. They were trophies, keepsakes the entity collected for itself, like a child preserving dead butterflies' wings. And now, as you watch this video, as you read these words, are you certain that sound behind you is just your house settling? Are you sure that shadow passing your window was merely a cloud? Press like if you dare continue this journey with us. Subscribe, because each week we uncover horrors far worse. And above all, beware of houses that stand too quiet, especially those that seem to watch you as you pass. Because some doors are better left closed, and some stories should never be told to their